It was supposed to be just another routine flight. But for one black girl, it turned into a battle that would shake the foundations of an airline. What began as a simple dispute with a flight attendant escalated into something far greater, something that would change everything. Watch as this passenger faces an unjust situation, only to find herself in control, completely flipping the script. This is a story of resilience, justice, and an unimaginable turn of events. Get ready, because this one W. Everything seemed normal as she boarded the plane. She had her ticket, was ready for a smooth flight, and had no idea the chaos that was about to unfold. As she settled into her seat, a seemingly minor incident occurred, a misunderstanding with the flight attendant. But what followed would leave everyone stunned. Instead of resolving the issue, the attendant took it further, kicking her off the plane. No one expected what would happen next. This was just the beginning, and the stakes were about tea. As the door closed behind her, she stood outside the plane, confused and frustrated. What had just happened? Why was she being treated this way? She had done nothing wrong. The feeling of humiliation and injustice washed over her, but she refused to back down. She knew something had to be done. Determined to make her voice heard, she didn't just walk away. No, she was about to do something that would change everything. Little did she know, the airline was about to regret their decision. She wasn't. Just 7 minutes. That's all it took. While most people would have walked away, she wasn't like everyone else. She made a call, her fingers typing furiously as she gathered everything she needed. She wasn't just looking for an apology, she was looking for justice. Within minutes, her voice reached the highest levels of the airline. The wheels of change were already in motion. The people who thought they could silence her were about to face a force they didn't see coming. Her determination wow. The airline, once calm and composed, was now in chaos. Within minutes of her call, the company had scrambled to respond. But this wasn't a simple customer complaint, they knew they were dealing with someone who wasn't backing down. The higher-ups were now involved, and the flight attendant who had kicked her off was about to face the consequences. As the pressure mounted, the airline executives realized the seriousness of the situation. They had underestimated her. Now, they had to act quickly or... Back in the office, she could hear the urgency in the voices on the other end of the line. People who once felt untouchable were suddenly shaken by her unwavering determination. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was a force. Within hours, the company issued a public apology, but she wasn't interested in empty words. She wanted change. She made it clear that her fight wasn't over until the entire system was held accountable. The stakes had just risen, and this was no longer just about her. The apology came, but it was too little, too late. She knew it wasn't enough. They were just trying to smooth things over, but she wasn't fooled. She wanted real accountability. She wasn't going to settle for token gestures or promises. She was prepared to take the battle all the way, to expose the flaws in the system that allowed for such mistreatment. The more she dug, the more she realized how deep the problem ran. And that's when she decided to take it a step further, much further. The next move was unexpected. She decided to take legal action. Not just against the flight attendant but against the entire airline for its systemic failure. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore, it was a fight for all passengers who had ever been wronged. As her case gained traction, the media caught wind of the story. What started as a small incident on a plane quickly became a viral sensation. The public was divided, some stood with her, while others defended the airline. But one thing was. As the legal case unfolded, it became evident that the airline was in deep trouble. Their reputation was crumbling. But this wasn't just about corporate damage control, it was about a woman who had become a symbol of justice. The more the story spread, the more support she gained from the public. What started as a personal quest for justice had now sparked a movement. She was no longer just a passenger, she had become a voice for the voiceless. Her resolve to bring the airline down had set in motion. The legal battle intensified. As the case gained national attention, her name became synonymous with standing up against injustice. The airline tried to mount a defense, but their attempts were futile. Every move they made only seemed to fuel her fight. The media buzzed with interviews, news reports, and social media posts. Support from advocates, human rights groups, and even other passengers flooded in. She had become more than just a passenger seeking justice, she was a symbol of empowerment. Behind closed doors, the airline's executives were scrambling. They were now fighting a battle they never anticipated. Legal teams were working around the clock, trying to come up with a strategy that could salvage what was left of the company's reputation. But it was too late. The public had already made up their mind. The story was everywhere. Social media was flooded with hashtags, memes, and videos. People were rallying behind her, demanding real changes in the airline industry. The battle L. As her case moved forward, she took a step that would solidify her role as a game-changer. She launched a campaign aimed at bringing transparency to airline policies, demanding accountability not just for her case, but for every passenger who had faced discrimination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for an entire community. Her efforts led to a coalition of activists, passengers, and legal professionals who rallied to her cause. Together, they vowed to change the law. Soon after, the tide began to turn in her favor. The airline, overwhelmed by public outrage, began to negotiate with her team. Behind the scenes, talks were underway. The company was considering policy changes, including better training for their staff, new diversity initiatives, and clearer rules on passenger treatment. But she wasn't backing down. She knew that real change didn't happen just through apologies and promises, it required action. She made it clear that her fight wasn't over until In an unexpected twist, the airline decided to offer her a seat at the table, a position that would allow her to oversee the implementation of the changes she had fought for. The woman who had been kicked off the plane now had the power to shape the future of the airline industry. It was a surreal moment, one that would have been unimaginable only weeks earlier. As she sat in meetings with top executives, she realized that her fight had not only changed her life, it had reshaped the very system. Her new role at the airline was no longer just symbolic, it was transformational. As she sat in meetings with the leadership team, she began to see firsthand the power of change from within. She pushed for new policies that prioritized fairness, inclusivity, and respect for every passenger, regardless of background. The resistance wasn't over, though. There were still skeptics within the company, some who were resistant to change. But she was relentless, using her platform to amplify the voices. Continued to watch closely. Every move she made was scrutinized, and many wondered if the airline would actually follow through with their promises. She knew that her work wasn't done. She took the responsibility of her new position seriously, knowing that the success of her efforts would determine the future of the company's relationship with its customers. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the airline industry. Slowly but surely, the company began to transform. The new policies were put into action, and the employees were undergoing rigorous training to ensure they understood the importance of diversity and equality. But the most significant change was the way passengers felt. Complaints dropped as customers began to see that the airline was truly listening to their concerns. For the first time in a long time, there was trust. And it all started with one woman's courage to stand up and make her voice heard. The ripple effects of her victory went far beyond the airline. Other companies in the industry began to take note of the changes she had spearheaded. The conversation about fairness, representation, and discrimination was no longer just a conversation, it was becoming a movement. Her actions had sparked a larger discussion about how institutions treat marginalized communities. What had started as a personal fight for justice had now evolved into a nationwide call for accountability in all industry. As the months passed, the woman's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at conferences, to advocate for policy changes on a global scale. The airline that once tried to silence her was now a model for other companies to follow. She had become not just an advocate but a leader, someone who had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. Her legacy was clear: through resilience and determination, one person could change the world. As her influence spread, her story became a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. She began receiving messages from people across the country, stories of their own struggles, of mistreatment and discrimination in the most unexpected places. She responded to every message, offering support, encouragement, and a reminder that their voices mattered. She had become more than just a symbol of justice; she was now a voice for the voiceless, showing people that change was possible, no matter how. Her newfound platform didn't stop at speaking engagements or social media. She started her own foundation, dedicated to fighting discrimination and promoting diversity across all sectors. The foundation quickly gained traction, attracting both corporate sponsors and grassroots supporters. It wasn't just about holding companies accountable anymore, it was about creating lasting change for marginalized communities. Her vision was clear: to create a world where no one would ever be silenced again. But not everyone was happy with her success. Critics, both inside and outside the airline, began to question her methods and her motivations. Were her actions truly for the greater good, or was she simply seeking revenge? But she refused to let the negativity derail her. She knew what she was fighting for, and that was all that mattered. The more they criticized, the more determined she became. She focused on her mission: creating an environment where everyone could feel respected and valued. The airline, now under intense scrutiny, began to truly change. They introduced diversity quotas, revamped their hiring practices, and ensured their staff received regular training on racial sensitivity and customer care. The journey was long and difficult, but there was no turning back now. As the company transformed, so did the entire industry. Other airlines followed suit, creating their own policies focused on diversity and fairness. What had started with one woman's fight for justice had no. Months later, the woman stood before a crowd, speaking at a global conference on corporate responsibility. Her words were powerful, but her actions had been even more impactful. She had not only fought for justice, she had created a blueprint for change. The crowd listened, captivated by her story, how one act of injustice had sparked a revolution in the airline industry. As she spoke, she realized the magnitude of what she had achieved. Her fight wasn't just her own, it was for everyone who had Her efforts to bring real change didn't go unnoticed. International media outlets began to cover her work, highlighting her as a true trailblazer for justice and equality. Interviews, documentaries, and features on her story flooded television and online platforms. She became a household name, not just for her actions against one airline, but for what she represented: the power of the individual to spark global transformation. But through all the attention, she remained grounded, knowing that her foundation continued to grow, expanding its reach to schools, workplaces, and government institutions. She launched initiatives aimed at educating people about racial inequality and unconscious bias. The Foundation's programs focused on creating inclusive environments, offering scholarships to those from marginalized communities, and providing legal support for those facing discrimination. She had turned her personal experience into a lifelong mission, making sure that no one would ever feel. The impact of her work was felt not just in the airline industry, but in every corner of society. Corporate leaders, politicians, and activists began to collaborate with her foundation, creating policies that reflected the values of fairness and respect. Her advocacy led to systemic changes that addressed issues from hiring practices to access to education. People across the world began to see her as more than a victim; she had become a pioneer for a more just and equal world. As the years went on, she remained steadfast in her mission. The airline that had once wronged her had become a model of accountability, and many others in the industry followed suit. She traveled the world, speaking at conferences, rallying people to join her cause. Every story she shared resonated with those who had been mistreated, and every victory she celebrated became a testament to the power of perseverance. She knew that the journey was long, but every step she took brought her closer to. One day, while standing in front of a crowd, she realized just how far she had come. From that fateful moment on the plane to sitting at the head of a global movement, her journey had been one of transformation. Not just for the airline industry, but for herself. She had gone from a passenger to a leader, from being silenced to becoming a voice for the voiceless. Her story was no longer just about what happened on that plane, it was about the power of resilience, courage, and the unshakable belief. Years later, her journey became the subject of countless books, documentaries, and talks. The once controversial case was now taught in classrooms as an example of how a single act of defiance could reshape an entire system. Schools began using her story to inspire young students to stand up against injustice. Her legacy had become a foundation for future generations, showing them that their voices mattered and that they could make a difference in the world, no matter their background. The impact of her fight continued to ripple across the world. International organizations began to partner with her foundation, ensuring that issues of racial discrimination and inequality were addressed on a global scale. Legislation started to reflect the changes she had championed. Public policies now focused on inclusivity, making workplaces, schools, and industries more welcoming to people from all walks of life. Her story had sparked a worldwide conversation that led to tangible, long-lasting. Through her tireless advocacy, she helped craft laws that set higher standards for diversity in hiring, workplace treatment, and customer service. Businesses across various sectors were held accountable for their actions, and penalties for discriminatory practices were more severe. As a result, companies started investing more in diversity training and creating transparent processes for handling complaints. What began as a fight for justice had evolved into a global movement for equality. Her public recognition reached new heights when she was invited to speak at the United Nations. There, she addressed leaders from around the world, urging them to continue fighting for a world where everyone, regardless of race, background, or gender, had the same opportunities and respect. Her words echoed through the halls, as she pushed for global policies that would ensure fairness for all. The woman who had once been unjustly thrown off a plane had now become an advocate for change on the W. As she reflected on her journey, she could hardly believe the magnitude of what had been accomplished. She had faced personal humiliation and discrimination, but she had turned those experiences into a source of power and inspiration. Her story wasn't just about one woman's fight, it was about the power of community, of people coming together to demand change. She had gone from being a passenger to a leader, and through her resilience, she had changed the world for the better. As the years passed, her foundation became a powerful force for good, reaching more people and changing more lives than she could have ever imagined. Communities that had once been silent in the face of inequality now had a platform to voice their struggles and solutions. Her organization became a lifeline for those fighting systemic discrimination, offering support, resources, and advocacy. She had become the architect of a movement that was about more than just the airline, it was about reshaping. The ripple effect of her actions spread across various industries, not just aviation. Retailers, tech companies, and even government agencies began adopting policies inspired by her work. Diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords, they were becoming integral to the culture of businesses everywhere. Her impact wasn't confined to a single sector, it had created a seismic shift in the way people thought about equality and opportunity. What had started as a single fight for justice had become Her efforts culminated in a major milestone when she was recognized with a global award for social change. Standing on stage, receiving the recognition she had worked so hard for, she reflected on the incredible journey she had taken. From the moment she was kicked off that plane, to becoming a global symbol for justice, she had never imagined the magnitude of the change she would inspire. She was no longer just an advocate, she had become a global leader in the fight for fairness. Despite her success, she remained humble and grounded. She knew that the work wasn't over, and she continued to push for deeper changes within the system. Her foundation expanded its reach, launching initiatives to address systemic racism in healthcare, education, and law enforcement. She knew that true equality could only be achieved when every aspect of society was held accountable. Her vision was clear: to create a world where every person was treated with dignity and respect. The years of tireless work had led to undeniable progress, but the fight wasn't over. She continued to speak out, advocating for further reforms and empowering others to find their voices. Her story had become a beacon for those who felt overlooked or oppressed, and she remained steadfast in her commitment to see the fight through. The woman who had once been forced off a plane now stood as a symbol of resilience, showing the world that even the most challenging battles could lead to profound change. As the years went by, the impact of her work continued to unfold. She was often invited to international forums, discussing how to implement the changes she had pioneered. Her voice echoed not just in the halls of the airline but also in chambers of government, corporate boardrooms, and community centers. She had become a go-to expert on equality and justice, traveling the world, influencing policies, and mentoring young leaders. Her journey had sparked an endless ripple effect, as people from accountable had now become a global network for change. It connected people, organizations, and governments, working collaboratively to tackle issues like racial injustice, gender inequality, and socioeconomic disparity. She had built an ecosystem of support and action that transcended borders. What had started as an isolated battle had transformed into a global movement, one that would continue long after she was gone. The world was waking you. Despite her growing success, she never lost sight of her original mission: to ensure that no one would ever face the discrimination she had endured. She worked tirelessly, even behind the scenes, to ensure that policies were followed through and that people who had been wronged received the justice they deserved. It wasn't just about policies, it was about changing hearts and minds. She knew that lasting change would only come when people understood and embraced the power of empathy and respect. Her influence spread beyond policy and law. She became a sought-after speaker in educational institutions, sharing her journey with students across the world. Universities began offering courses on social justice that incorporated her experiences and lessons learned. Her story was one of resilience, grit, and unyielding determination to stand up for what was right. For students, she was more than just an example of success, she was a living testament to the power of standing up for justice, even. As she reflected on the legacy she had built, she realized that the fight for equality had changed her as much as it had changed the world. The personal growth, the knowledge, the relationships, she had become a different person. The woman who had once been kicked off a plane had now become a global champion for justice. Every victory, every moment of progress, was a reminder that one person, with courage and determination, could spark a revolution. She knew her work was far from over, but she was. The ongoing transformation of the airline industry was only one chapter in her story. Her advocacy had evolved to challenge global norms, including pushing for racial equality in tech, healthcare, and education. She began speaking at international summits, demanding that businesses adopt transparency and accountability measures. No sector was too big to ignore the calls for change. Her voice resonated in boardrooms, but more importantly, it echoed in the streets, where activists and everyday CIT. As her influence grew, she saw the seeds of change take root in unexpected places. Corporate leaders who once dismissed her message were now actively seeking her guidance on how to foster inclusivity in their companies. Even local communities were getting involved, holding their leaders accountable for systemic inequality. The vision she had fought for was slowly becoming a reality. People were no longer sitting back, they were demanding change, and it was starting to happen. Overwhelming success of her movement, she remained focused on the future. Her foundation began to expand its efforts, offering programs that directly impacted underserved communities. They provided grants for businesses owned by people of color, scholarships for underrepresented students, and mentorship for those trying to break into industries that had long excluded them. She was committed to ensuring that those who had been historically marginalized had the resources and support to. The public's perception of her had shifted, too. She was no longer just the woman who had been wronged, she had become an icon of resilience, a symbol of what could be achieved when one person refused to be silenced. Her work had earned her accolades, but the recognition wasn't what drove her. She remained focused on the end goal, dismantling the systems that perpetuated inequality and creating a world where everyone had equal opportunities to thrive. Her legacy was now cemented in history. The once small movement had grown into a global force, with thousands of people advocating for justice, equality, and inclusion. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Every victory brought new challenges, new barriers to overcome. The work was endless, but she remained steadfast, driven by the belief that a fairer world was within reach. Her journey had begun with a single act of defiance, and now it had sparked a global revolution. She had shown the world W. As the movement she ignited continued to grow, she found herself constantly reflecting on the journey. From a lone passenger to a global leader, the transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Her work had sparked widespread change, but more importantly, it had inspired millions to believe in their own power to create change. People from all corners of the world, regardless of race, gender, or background, were now fighting alongside her for a better future. It was no longer about one woman. And so, as she stood at the forefront of a global movement, she knew the story was far from over. The challenges ahead were still monumental, but she had seen firsthand the incredible impact that one determined person could have. She had transformed not just an airline, but an entire industry, and in doing so, she had reshaped the world. The fight for equality would continue, but with each passing day, the world moved closer to the fairness and justice she had always dreamed of. She had not just